Back in January at our laborers' breakfast, Bill Ritchie got up and mentioned something very special was going to happen in the state legislature regarding the opportunity for the legislature to pass a bill designating May as Labor History Month in the state of New York. And that happened. So all kinds of bells and whistles blew up in my mind when that happened, and I'm like, Bill, need to see it, Bill, need to see it, need to see it, need to see it. And he couldn't figure out what in the heck I needed to see him about. Well, what I wanted to see him about is what we're here for today. And I'm very excited to have not only our elected officials here, but all of our labor people and other interested parties to be here today for this very special day. And that's Albany County Labor History Month in Albany County. And that's why we are here today.
It is wonderful to see that, at least in New York here, we are remembering our history. We are trying to cherish our history. And part of it is, again, not just to enlighten ourselves and not just to remember. It is to remind people the shoulders that we stand on. I told him my father came here and started in the Chicago stockyards, that have been gone for many, many decades. And then went on to, it was labor that helped catapult my family into the middle class. And then I would be completely remiss, Paul, if I didn't say that Kate Mullaney, what you've done, such a tremendous shout out to Paul Cole and others to keep our history alive. And so it is one effort feeding off another.
The next individual is, again, as you heard me earlier, I reached out to him at our laborer breakfast, which we have every single month. And I don't think in the 6 years that I've been there, I may have missed 2 of them at the very most for either health issues or family issues. But I go to them, I attend them, I listen. There's a lot you can learn about what's going on, not only locally in Albany County with labor issues, but also throughout the state of New York. I've attended several events when strikes were going on throughout our communities to support labor unions. Mark Emanation is here. Mark is very strong when it comes to that stuff to let us know exactly what we need to do as local politicians to assist with these things. And at all times I try to do my best as your county clerk to support whatever issues are going on with labor. So without any further ado, I want to introduce somebody whom I've been working steadfastly with since January to put this program together today. His name is Bill Ritchie. He's sitting to my left here. He's going to be doing some introductions and introducing our guest speaker for today. But Bill grew up in Ireland, and he is very well educated in secondary and undergraduate education from Northern Ireland. And he's also graduated from SUNY Albany here locally with an MS in education. He's worked in Waterford and the Albany school districts up until 2009. I believe he retired at that point. Yeah. But in retirement, he wasn't done. He proceeded to work for the New York State Nurses Association for 5.5 years. He was president of the Albany Public School Teachers Association for 14 years, and that's a great accomplishment. Thank you for that. He has so many accolades during his tenure as a teacher. He's been a delegate to the New York State United Teachers and American Federation of Teachers conventions. He's helped shape state and national union policy on civil and human rights issues, divestment from apartheid South Africa, and promoted the interest of small and rural teacher unions locally. Currently, he is the executive member of the Capital District Area Labor Federation and president of the Albany County Central Federation of Labor. He has supported the maintenance and expansion of the labor movement locally, nationally, and across our great country. His activism continues, and he attends demonstrations organized by the Labor Federation and other progressive organizations and labor organizations in our community. When you listen to him, you'll understand why I opened up that he's from Ireland. He's a great guy and a gentleman that I'm proud to call my friend, Bill Ritchie.
I looked at the program when I came here, and even though I was integrally involved in developing the program, I didn't realize that I was going to be given so much time, right? So I'm going to not take all that time. Let me just tell you that much right now, right? When I retired from the Albany City School District, or tried to retire, it was a miserable failure, I can tell you that right now. But anyway, when I retired from the Albany Public Schools, I waited for a couple of months. A friend of mine encouraged me to work for the Nurses Union, right? And I ended up working for them for 5.5 years. And one of the things that I did on a very regular basis was do orientations for new nurses, right? So you'd have young women, young men coming in to Ellis Hospital, where I was working, and I would be standing at the front of the room and telling them all about the union movement and the benefits of the union movement and what achievements the union movements had made. And they would look at me like I was from Mars, right? Now, the reason for that is because for some reason or other, and I mean, we all have our theories about these things, but for some reason or other, we have people graduating from schools across this country who have very little sense or consciousness about the labour movement or about the contributions which the labour movement have made to the welfare and the benefit of all working people in this country, right? So that was something that really hit me, because I had been a union president for 14 years, and as a union president, you're doing 19 to the dozen things, and sometimes things that you really want to change don't actually get onto your agenda. But one of those things that I'm regretful about was that I didn't do more about changing the curriculum. It's not exactly what union presidents do, as you know, right? But nevertheless, it was something which I really, really should have been doing, I think, and didn't get to. Now, I just want to say that the Labour History Month was initiated, the resolution was initiated by Paul Cole, and Paul has been recognised already as the Executive Director of the American Labour Studies Centre, and he's been enormous work with the Kit Mullaney House and with a variety of other things, including a really pretty outstanding website, right? But we got the Assemblyman MacDonald and Assemblyperson Pat Payne and Senator Neil Breslin, with a lot of support from, let me see now, Assemblyman Phil Steck, and well, I did mention Pat, right? But they got the resolution through the Assembly and through the Senate, and it sort of sailed through. But it was interesting because there were people who spoke to this thing, particularly in the Senate, who came across as being extremely well prepared and extremely sensitive to labour issues. And I'll get back to that in a couple of minutes, right? I have to thank Bruce for all the work that he has done and for the support he has given this project. I mean, I'm just thrilled by the fact that every single seat, I think, with the exception of mine, is in this room is filled this morning, right? Thank you, Bruce, right? Because we were fighting up against a very serious lobbying day, Today, the legislature is like a madhouse. I can guarantee you that right now, right? There'll be people up and down the stairs and the hallways doing all sorts of crazy stuff, right? But not too crazy at all, most of it, let's be honest. Okay, I also want to thank the people who have contributed financially to this event, and you have those people listed, those groups listed on the back of your program, and I know you all can read really well, right? So if you just turn over the program, you will see there the different people. But we really did appreciate the super support that we have gotten from our own legislators in our region, and sometimes from further away too. As well as that, I wanted to thank Paul for the support that he has given us from the American Labour Studies program, right? And as well as that, let's see now. You may have picked up the flyer which is sitting on the table over there, which describes the program which is going to take place at the Coast Music Hall, a really wonderful building, by the way, and really wonderful program. It's entitled Mother Jones in Heaven. And just as an added incentive, right? If you go there at 6 o'clock instead of 7:30, there's going to be a reception. And the reception is going to be catered by Joe's Tavern in Cohoes. Now, Joe's Tavern in Cohoes has a very strong reputation for catering. And I believe they do the catering for the Van Scoy Golf Club, is that right? Country Club?
Correct.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're dealing with some serious people here. And as well as that, Ben and Jerry's is going to provide ice cream, another very serious organization, right? Okay, fair enough. Let's see. It's my pleasure to have been working with our speaker today. But before I do it, just one more thing. Yesterday, I got a letter from two of the senators who had been working on this resolution, Senator Julia Salazar and Robert Jackson, right? They're both, I think, from the city, right? But they wrote, I want to read the letter to you. It's really short, okay? To the Albany Labour community, we are writing to congratulate the Albany Labour community on your celebration of Labour History Month. Your exhibition of Labour history archival materials in the Hall of Records throughout this month is a tremendous resource for your community. It provides a vivid reminder to all who view it, and the quality of life that many enjoy is directly related to Albany's high rate of unionisation. We know that Albany is home to many proud union locals, from the public sector, state, county and municipal workers to this region's tremendous educators from K-12 through higher education, and to the skilled building trades, labourers and journeymen who have built and continue to build Albany's skyline and campuses. And that letter is from Julia Salazar, Senator Salazar, and Senator Robert Jackson. Okay, so moving ahead, our speaker, Karen, right? Karen is currently the chair of the Women and Gender Study Programme at Tompkins Courtauld Community College. She's been there since 1990. She is also, I believe, in charge of the honours programme and is, of course, a full professor of history and somebody who has had a very, very concentrated and focused interest on labour history particularly, and women's labour history. So I think we're really very lucky to have her. She is somebody who has written on labour history and on events of that type. And I'm not going to list them because those things again are in your program. But I did, I was looking last night on my computer, and the way students do assessments of people. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
You go and teach in the college and they tell you you're horrible or you're brilliant, right? But anyway, here's the sort of stuff that people are writing about her, right? Skip class, ? You won't pass, right? 2, lots of homework. 3, participation matters. 4, tough grader. No lightweight. This is what I'm saying, okay? No lightweight as a labour historian, right? We are really thrilled to have somebody coming all the way from Dryden, New York, right? It's a long way, right? To address us this morning. And that person is Karen Pastorello. And thank you so much for coming, Karen, right?
Yes, thank you everybody for the great turnout, and it's a pleasure to be here to celebrate Labor History Month. And the month of May usually is sunnier than this, so this is our sunny time. I, as you can read in your program, have a long history of labor history in my family. I was raised by my grandparents, who were both, my grandfather was actually a laborer for the city of Rochester way back in the 1920s and 30s forward, and my grandmother worked for Timely Clothes, which was unionized by the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. She was actually hand sewed, she threaded over 200 needles, I still remember this as a little girl, every night, and she went into work and sewed buttons on men's suit clothes, which at the time were high quality men's suits in Rochester, New York. So I kind of grew up alongside of His Holy Franklin Roosevelt, and Sidney Hillman was worshipped in my grandmother's house. So, and that is who I did my dissertation on, Sidney Hillman's wife, Bessie Abramovich Hillman, who was, I argue, the founder of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, but her husband probably gets more credit for founding it than he deserves. So anyway, that's where I come from, and thank you again so much for being here. And it was a pleasure to kind of put together my PowerPoint on labor history. So Ken Burns is a fairly famous film documentarian who's done all kinds of documentaries, and he quoted once that we can't know where we're going unless we know where we came from. So my intention here today, in a really brief amount of time, is to show you kind of where we came from as far as workers and who worked in this country, and particularly who worked in New York State and closer to home in Albany County. So you can go ahead and hit the next slide. And one of the questions I had for myself as I started is kind of where to start this presentation. And we can go way back to the indigenous population in New York State, which has a rich, rich labor history. If we think of labor, working people, as being especially unpaid, you know, we tend to associate work and success and all that kind of thing with money and how much we make, but that wasn't always the case. However, by 1900, which is the point I decided to start it, I thought it was a nice even date, the United States was definitely industrializing, and particularly New York State and upstate New York were included in that industrial map. And you can see, and there's a key there, and it's actually the shaded kind of bluish gray areas that are the most industrialized along the eastern seaboard, really, and across what at the time was initially the Erie Canal, and now you can think of it in terms of the thruway, right, from Buffalo to Rochester to Syracuse to Albany, and then down to the city. And that was kind of the center of production. What kinds of things are being produced around 1900? Well, as Pat mentioned, the stockyards in Chicago with the meat and food production were just kind of really taking off. Across upstate New York, which initially was called the hinterlands, we have a lot of the raw materials that are going down into the cities, into New York City in particular, to be produced. Shoes and clothes were really the first big products that began in the 19th century to come out of New York City back upstate, and lots of other things as well. So I want to go closer to New York and see. New York State in general, in 1900, was considered a rural state. So the majority of the population were actually farmers until about 1910. Then we become classified as an urban state, where more than half the population is living in what were considered urban areas. So this is kind of an idyllic picture of what most of New York, other than the cities and especially New York City, looked like at the time. New York is always kind of ahead of the curve if we're looking at big national statistics. So as I said, New York is classified as an urban state by 1910. Nationally, we become an urban nation by 1920. So we're kind of 10 years ahead of the curve that way. So one of the first things we look at, even if we're looking at 1900, are farmers and their families. And if we look at kind of the division in the country that is still in many ways very evident between the North and the South, we have northern farmers and their families, and in the South we have predominantly agricultural regions that are labored by sharecroppers. Sharecroppers are the workers, and of course many of these sharecroppers are descendants of slaves families during the Civil War, still literally entrenched, stuck in the South, because they don't have the means. They're in a system called not only sharecropping but debt peonage. They're in a lot of debt and they can't come north. You know, mobility takes money. And so they're firmly entrenched in the South. In the North, what we have are independent farmers for the most part. And in the picture on the top is the farmer's wife, who is an intricate part of the family. And the farmer's wives, and you can see this woman's actually doing some writing. The farmers' wives, in many cases, are the people who leave behind some record of what life was like on the farm. This is one of the problems with studying labor history. Bessie Abramovich Hillman, as I mentioned, who I wrote about, had a saying. She said she didn't leave much writing behind because she was a doer, not a writer. She was out there organizing and organizing people into unions and speaking and doing all kinds of things. So she didn't have time to sit down and write, or she was probably too darn exhausted to do that. So the records in the early 1900s, especially when it comes to working class people, are relatively scarce. And that's why a place like this, which I love being in archives, it's like, you know, my happy place, I guess. That's why places like this are so vital to telling the story of workers and to bringing those people's lives to light, because it's not just the big names, it's not just the leaders, it's literally, in our case, millions of workers in America that we need to learn more about. So this is obviously a map of New York State, and you can see all the counties on there, and you can see also not only the major cities, but many of the what at the time were referred to as third-class cities as well. They had different laws and different kinds of production. For instance, Binghamton was considered a third-class city. Ithaca was considered a third-class city. One of the differences, it's in some ways related to labor, is that, for instance, women could run for school boards in third-class cities, but not in some of the bigger cities in 1880, 1890, and so on. So we have these kind of intricate differences. But New York by 1900 is definitely a vital place. It's definitely populated as a state. And we have all these smaller industrial towns as well. New York City, again, is not only the most populous, but the most industrial city in the country around the turn of the century. This is actually a map from 1922, and I realize you can't see all the fine print. But what it's talking about are the different industries that are predominant in New York. Women's wear, women's clothing, what was at the time was referred to as ready-to-wear clothing. This is one of the first times you could actually go to a store and not have to go to a tailor or a seamstress and have your clothes made. So women's ready-to-wear, men's ready-to-wear, which starts way back with uniforms in the Civil War. Food products and tobacco, metal, leather, wood, drugs and chemicals, painting and publishing, the kind of typical industrial products we think of at the turn of the century, and some of the bigger industrial centers in the country come first in New York. How are they populating the means of production? With not only farmers and their families moving in to take these newly available industrial jobs, but also the various waves of immigrants. And in history, we actually have subfields, and one of the subfields is immigration history. And immigration historians tell us that there are three major waves of immigrants that come to the country. So we have the first wave, which is on my far left, right? Yeah, I have a problem with right and left. The first wave on the far left are people predominantly from Northern and Western Europe, the British Isles, Ireland, a lot of the other, some of the Scandinavian countries, and of course some people from Asia are also included in this very early wave, those people who work on the railroads and in the mines during the gold rush, for example. Then we have the biggest wave, sometimes referred to as the Great Migration, in the middle. These are people primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe, so Russia, Lithuania, Hungary, Poland, Italy. These are some of the countries these people are coming from. And it will be that middle wave of immigrants in particular at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century that take a lot of the jobs in factories. And the factory owners exploited these people beyond belief. One of the ways they exploited them was because most of the time these people weren't native English speakers, and they were referred to a lot of times as greenhorns, people who were new to the United States, and they would be paid less. The typical kind of immigrant story. They would have to work very long hours. They would work in very unsafe conditions. Everybody, not just the immigrants, but in some ways the immigrants more predominantly. If anybody is interested in tracing their family history back, there's a really good site. I haven't been on it in a while, but it was really user-friendly, called ellisisland.org. And if you have parents or grandparents or even great-grandparents that came between 1892 and 1924, you can look and see. You can probably find them on the website. I looked forever for my grandfather, who came from Italy in 1914, the first year of the World War in Europe, and I couldn't find him. And it dawned on me finally, the reason I couldn't find him was because he came illegally. He was only 15 years old, and it was illegal to come, so they had to lie. And I said, so my friend has a sign that says, "I am the grandchild of an immigrant," outside her office door. And I said, I can top that. I'm the grandchild of an illegal immigrant. So anyway. And then we had the third wave of immigrants, the more recent wave, mostly from Central and South America and also Asia. If we look at New York State, I went as far west as time allows, and I looked at Bethlehem Steelworks in Lackawanna, which is outside of Buffalo, and it was a very vital center of steel production really until the 1970s. And I can remember going through Lackawanna and literally smelling the steel production in the air. I mean, it was pervasive all over the place. So many of the early immigrants that came and went as far west to Buffalo, you know, they'd come in Ellis Island, and then many of them came upstate, depending on who they knew. And they would end up working in foundries, and eventually the steel workers are one of the first and one of the strongest unions, yes, in especially New York, but eventually in the rest of the country, Virginia, in fact, and so on. And then, you know, I'm traveling kind of along the thruway now, Rochester, which as I mentioned, I grew up in. If you grew up when I did in Rochester, your parents, if they worked at all, generally worked in one of two places, either Eastman Kodak, which we called the Great Yellow Father, you know, if you remember when it was big, everything was yellow with red insignia, or Xerox by that time, which starts out as Haloid. But at the turn of the century, Kodak is definitely up and coming, and you can see George Eastman, who was originally born in Waterville, is that how you say it? Fleet, yeah, sorry. Yes, he ends up as a very young boy founding or experimenting and eventually founding Kodak, which for years was the only place to get a camera. And then also in Rochester, the top two industries in the turn of the century were camera production and clothing. Men's, like I was talking about, my grandmother was part of this. So Adler was the very first clothing company, Adler Brothers. Three Jewish men started Adler Brothers. And you can see the women, and they're working in some of the same conditions. I hope you can see this, wooden floor, scraps of fabric all over, that are very reminiscent of the way the Triangle Shirtwaist factory workers were working, very combustible. And then we have Syracuse. In Syracuse, we have some of the big furniture makers. We have salt production in the upper right-hand corner. Those are the salt spreaders. In Syracuse, I learned fairly recently, did not have salt mines, but they had salt springs where they extracted the salt from. And these are some of the spreaders drying the salt. They were also known for clay and china production. Syracuse China, until probably the last decade or so, was a very big employer. And also related, Onondaga, which is the county Syracuse is in, Onondaga Pottery Company of Syracuse, China, employed lots of people. And there's something called the Plate Club. And they have it in restaurants still. If you go out maybe to a diner and you lift your plate up, underneath you'll say, see Syracuse, China. I guess it was kind of a game people played for a long time. And then the Capital Region, and I think most people here are more familiar with what goes on in the Capital Region. And so I tried to pick out kind of a representative sample. And you see the collar workers, kind of helping with that ready-to-wear clothing, ironworks, breweries, and some of the hosiery mills that were prevalent at the turn of the century. So a great place for labor history, and as some of the events that are still coming can lend insight into what's going on here. So the workers, whether in the Capital District, whether they're in Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, or in a place like Baltimore or Boston, all have the same hours and eventually the same demands, the same union demands in particular. This is it's called iconography, or really a poster, we would call it, from the Knights of Labor, which is a very early labor association that dates back to about 1869, founded by Philadelphia tailors. And they were given a lot of credit for their breakdown of the workday into 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we would now call leisure time, is really what they're all about. And those demands, even though the union, or the Knights of Labor Association, kind of falls apart and some of the slack is taken up by Gompers and the AFL, we begin to see those demands that the Knights first articulated. The hours demands, so hours, they were trying for a 10-hour day. That was what was considered a good working day. Wages, they want to make, at the turn of the century, more than just a few cents a day, which some were doing. Conditions, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the conditions of, as I said, the fire hazards with the combustible materials and buildings and so on, and poorly lit, poorly ventilated, etc. And last but not least, union recognition. There were unions trying to form at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, but they were unsuccessful. They had just about everything they could possibly have working against them, particularly government intervention. At the national level, the state level, and even the local level, the union efforts in many cases were shut down. Troops were called out. In Chicago, local police were called out. The workers were beaten, arrested, lost their jobs, just the worst case scenario, and got very little accomplished. The clothing industry was one of the first to begin to move ahead with something called the Protocols of Peace in 1913 that gave workers for a time better conditions. Child labor was not necessarily one of the demands or primary concerns of people trying to unionize and remedy problems at the time, but it was definitely something that needed to be addressed. And the progressive reformers, many of them who came out of the settlement movement in places like Jane Addams Hull House in Chicago, or Lillian Wald's Henry Street settlement in New York, or Utica, Rochester had settlement houses, tried to help especially poor immigrant workers and their families not only get jobs, learn English, get citizenship, but help with this child labor, because this was what was referred to as homework. Some of these pictures are from Lewis Hine, who was the first to care about working people in terms of photographing what was going on in the workplace. Not only did workers not have a lot of records to leave behind or not have a lot of writings, but nobody really cared, what their conditions were like. Especially when it came to children, and you can see that's a classic picture of a woman and her children in a tenement in New York. Lewis Hine took most of his pictures in New York. And what they're doing in these pictures is putting little petals of flowers together, and then they would bring those bunches of flowers back to the flower factories and be paid a few cents per bunch. Those flowers were extremely popular because that's what decorated a lot of clothes and hats and so on at the time. The Newsies, and again, they've been some good films and documentaries on the Newsies. Child workers in the agricultural field, and child workers in especially the southern textile mills. There's excellent books written about what was going on in the southern textile mills. So workers are making very slow progress at the turn of the 19th and into the early 20th century. One problem is something called welfare capitalism. Welfare capitalism is an idea that certain employers, like for instance George Eastman, followed. And what welfare capitalism did is it gave better wages, better conditions, and things like paid vacation or health care. They would set up like a little nurse's or doctor's office right in the plants at Kodak. It made life a little bit better for the workers, and it was a way of resisting unionization. It was a very big tool against unions, because the thought was if conditions and things get better for the workers, then they won't need unions. If we give them a little bit more pay, if we give them paid vacations, health care, they're not going to need it. So this is successful in some of the big industries. Heinz was another one. Endicott, Johnson, which was a huge shoe production industry in and around what is now Binghamton. But we still had workers, nonetheless, that weren't satisfied, or in the case of the clothing industries, they weren't unionized yet. So they're going on strike for better pay, lesser hours, and better working conditions. And this is a strike that occurred in Rochester in the clothing industry in 1913, and the sign reads conditions in 8-hour days. So they went for what Gompers will call pure and simple unionism. Get our immediate needs met, and then we'll take it from there. So, as I said, a lot of people, first of all, we're, as I said, basically a rural area. you have to think about how people are getting or not getting their news. Most of them are dependent on newspapers, some daily, some weekly newspapers. They're living in rural areas. They have no clue, many of the Americans at the time, about what's going on in the workplace until 1911, when the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire makes national news headlines, huge, what they call banner headlines across the country, talking about this has 141 men and girls die in waste factory fire. That's what the headline is here. And of course, we know now that it's actually 146 workers, mostly Italian and immigrant women and young girls who perish in the Triangle fire. This is what's left of the 9th floor. The fire was the worst on the 9th floor. And I think most of you know the story of Triangle, but I'll just kind of encapsulate it for those who don't. So Triangle Shirtwaist was a company that made women's shirtwaists, which were high-collared, and then they eventually become a little bit lower-collared blouses. We would say today blouses, white blouses. So they're working, sewing the blouses, and really all that's left is the sewing machines. And they're working on March 25th, which was a Saturday, 1911. And it was not unusual to work 5.5, 6 days a week. So they're working on Saturday. It was almost closing time, and a fire breaks out. There was a big trial, and you can read the transcripts. And by the way, Cornell Industrial and Labor Relations School has a great website on the Triangle Factory fire. And on their website, they have the trial transcripts, and they talk about how, yes, the fire broke out, so what do people do? Like we were pointed out, the exits, right? They head for the exits. Well, unfortunately, the exit doors were locked. They were locked because the owners, Isaac Harris and Max Blanc, were afraid of employees stealing material, stealing textile material, or taking breaks that were too long. So they kept the employees literally locked in. It's thought that somebody tossed a cigarette butt in one of the bins where they kept this scrap fabric, and that's kind of how the fire started, and it went up so quick that a few did get out. Some jumped from windows. The firemen came with nets right away. The factory was located on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floor of what's called the Ash Building. It's now owned by New York University. And the ladders didn't reach high enough, and the hoses didn't reach high enough. So it was pretty much a lost cause. And many of these women jumped to their death. That's why when I saw 9/11, it brought back memories of how it must have felt at the Triangle Shirtwaist, people catapulting out windows and so on. So you have these national headlines, and finally people begin to wake up. You know, and they begin to come around in a big way and think about supporting unions and making conditions better for workers. But it doesn't happen overnight. Just because the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire resulted in a commission in New York State where over 30 health and safety laws are passed, including the exit charts and the fire extinguisher I see there and sprinkler systems, all these things came out of Triangle. It doesn't mean that everything was corrected and that we had no more worker deaths because of conditions. In Binghamton, a very similar situation in 1913, 2 years after Triangle, that nobody really talks about or knows too much about, 31 workers died in that fire just 2 years after Triangle. And a lot of times you find this, I found this when I was researching something else. I just kind of came across it, and I said, I never realized this, even though I went to Binghamton University, never knew it. So go ahead. So finally, things begin to get better, as I said, gradually, slowly. Franklin Roosevelt, like one of his predecessors, Woodrow Wilson, is seen as being very pro-labor. His wife in particular, Eleanor, was extremely pro-labor and kind of pushed him. Franklin Roosevelt hires for his Secretary of Labor a woman named Frances Perkins, who anybody who's ever worked minimum wage jobs or is collecting or thinking about collecting Social Security has Frances Perkins to thank for this. Yeah, so Roosevelt and Perkins together passed, it's not on here, but the Social Security Act in 1935. Also under Roosevelt, the Wagner Act was passed, which gave workers the right to organize. the right to bargain collectively, and the right to strike. So it protected workers' rights for a time anyway. In 1938, another major act called the Fair Labor Standards Act is passed into law. And I tell my students when we talk about the legacy of the New Deal that they have probably all been affected by this if they've ever worked for pay, part, or full time. It gives us for the first time in 1938 minimum wage, which does anybody want to guess what the first minimum wage was?
25 cents.
Yes, 25 cents. It was a quarter with the provision that it would go up to 40 cents in 1940. Maximum hours at the time were set at 8 hours a day, time and a half for overtime in most factories. And one of the things we need to think about with this Fair Labor Standards Act is it doesn't cover everybody all at once, and it still has some groups that are kind of left out of the standards, particularly at the time farm and hotel and restaurant workers were not big groups that were not included. Child labor prohibitions. This is the second time that the federal government passes child labor laws. The first time was under Wilson, and they were only in effect for 2 years before they were declared unconstitutional. Now, children cannot work in factories. It's very technical. The wording is they conduct interstate commerce if they're under the age of 16. So really what it means is kids can't be working in big factories. Where should they be instead? In school. So New York State takes one of the leads in passing what are called compulsory attendance laws, so that kids, instead of, this is prohibited. Why? Because they're supposed to be in school instead. So New York State has a pretty good record, and I guess it's getting better, right, as we go. As Pat said, there's still so much work to do. Other people have said that too. We can't stop where we are. But New York State has some notoriety when it comes to labor history firsts and precedents. It created the first State Department of Labor right here in Albany in 1901. The Factory Investigating Committee I already mentioned came out of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and was responsible for over 30 health and safety laws in the workplace. We have the strictest child labor laws in the United States. Depending on how old you are, when you got your first job, chances are pretty good. If you were in New York, you had to go through your school to get permission to be able to work part-time, and there's all kinds of other regulations. Strongest paid family leave program in the nation that just went into effect recently, and again, that's a gradual, they're unveiling that gradually, or unpacking as they like to say. So not everybody is covered. It doesn't mean you're going to get 100% of your wages, but it's a start. I think we're one of 6 states, if I'm not mistaken, in the country that has such a provision. What you see here, there's some under other evils of the tenement manufacturing, kids doing homework, like that picture I showed you of Lewis Hine. What is being fought for in other states is maternity and paternity leave, paid paternity leave, and then some of the real early documents that came out of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire Investigating Commission. They wrote volumes. They wrote over 6 volumes, hundreds of pages thick, of investigations that they did into almost each and every factory of any size in New York, everything from candy production to, of course, clothing production, box factories. There's all kinds of things. And the good thing is they're digitized, a lot of this, so you can now get to them online. So telling labor's story, we benefit from what we call social history, and not only do we care about workers, but we begin to think about how to tell their story. And so the archives here, our Albany County Hall of Records sample holdings, and this is just some information, very little that I got off from the website. And you can see here, there's a guide to special research collections. So as you probably know, you can look at finding aids that are online. You have all kinds of various finding aids, and if you're trying to tell the story of labor, they're actually insightful if you think about how to use these. For instance, the almshouse records. An almshouse was at first kind of a charity, hospital, refuge, poorhouse, kind of everything in one. And how many workers were in the almshouse? Well, you can actually, explore who was there and some of the reasons they came in and so on. Who was getting widow and orphan benefits? That was a big thing before Social Security. If the husband, who sometimes was the main breadwinner, died, what happened to the family? Well, you can look at these records right here and look at them pertaining to Albany County. The fire department, the police department. Not only will they show us about workers who are police and firemen, but they'll show us about maybe who the criminals were and what their occupations were. And there's all kinds of things you can do with these records. And that's the almshouse. And then, we see the plaque for the Kate Mullaney House. Mm-hmm. And so going forward, when we're trying to tell the stories of workers, one thing we need to realize is, the history of the workplace changes in the later decades of the 20th century. But as we go forward, especially into the 21st century, being inclusive, telling the story of all workers, and as I mentioned, farmers and their wives and sharecroppers are workers, not necessarily always getting paid in the traditional sense. These are Native American men digging blocks of ice at the turn of the century from a lake. They're workers. They're workers we don't know, we haven't seen a lot about, and they need to be included. When we're talking about labor and labor movements, even though maybe they're not officially unionizing, they're still workers that we need to tell their story. Also, domestic workers, as I said, a lot of groups are kind of left out of even some of the early policies. Domestic workers are one big group. African Americans in general, it's very hard to tell the story. It's difficult to tell the story of workers, especially minority workers. Very few records to go by. They're there, you have to know how to look, you have to dig really, really deep. What stories they have to tell. And last but not least, I'd be remiss, I guess, women, still the biggest minority in the United States. There's a movement in New York towards an ERA. So women are, for the majority of the 20th century, what we call traditional women's jobs. Around the 1960s, with the civil rights activism and all of that, you begin to see women going into non-traditional occupations, healthcare and service on the far right. Rosie is a myth. That's another thing about talking about history. Women did work in the defense industries. If you look at the poster of Rosie, this is government propaganda. They're making Rosie look patriotic and strong, right? Because she's got to replace the men at these heavy-duty, very physical jobs. The reason I'm saying in some ways it's a myth, or she's a myth, even though she's a national icon, right, is because most women first of all, poor and minority women have always worked. They didn't enter the workplace for the first time during World War II. So that's one myth. Secondly, more women worked in government bureaucracy than they did doing things like riveting airplanes or welding ships or whatever Rosie was represented doing. So although there were some Rosies, the majority of women had always been working kind of behind the scenes, and mostly a lot of menial jobs, especially if they're minority women, and or if they're working during the war, they're working for the Pentagon as clerical workers, or we now say maybe executive or administrative assistants. Then you'd hear the term secretary or receptionist or whatever. But so not only do we, number one, need to unearth all workers' stories and consider the kinds of work they were doing and the kinds of people they were, but we need to shatter some of what's become national myth as well. So the challenges that remain in the 21st century workforce, and again, I just highlighted some of the bigger ones. Basic workplace benefits and job stability in the wake of deindustrialization and downsizing. Unions, labor, without question, are under attack. People are fighting for everything I've mentioned, but job stability is a big one. Civil rights across all workspaces, and again, the definition of who should be included as a minority in civil rights has expanded dramatically. Organizing in an increasingly anti-union environment, the labor movement, unionization has so much work to do every day just to stay afloat and move forward. And last but not least, activism toward health care for all workers. Frances Perkins and her counterparts way back in the early part of the century wanted to pass universal health care for all workers. It was actually a provision of the Social Security bill, but Roosevelt told her to get it out of there because it would probably result in the defeat of Social Security, which at the time I think that was a good call. Also climate change and labor involvement in being aware and fighting against adverse climate change is something I don't have on there, but needs to be attended to. And reaching out to embrace a diverse past and celebrate an inspired future. Politicalization is very important, and the last picture is what people were referring to, the New York State Assembly and Senate.
It's Godfrey.
Yeah, so, thank you.
All right.